To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you. Your support literally makes this show possible. We couldn't do any of this without you. If you value this work and you want to help us grow, become a patron. We rely on listeners like you to sustain the show. Join at patreon.com/deathpanelpod and get access to weekly bonus episodes and our full back catalog with hundreds of hours of bonus content. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Transmisogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Bolton, and today I'm really excited to be joined by our guest, Jess Whatcott. They are a writer and an abolitionist organizer, as well as an assistant professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at San Diego University. Their research focuses on carceral and eugenicist state violence in jails and prisons, institutions for disability confinement, migrant detention centers, and other eugenics programs. And they are the author of the new book, Menace to the Future, A Disability and Queer History of Carceral Eugenics, which is published by Duke University Press. And I'm so glad to have them on the show to discuss the book. Jess, welcome to the Death Panel, and thank you so much for joining me today and speaking with me about the book.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Now, listeners, as I mentioned at the top, Jess's book is called Menace to the Future, A Disability and Queer History of Carceral Eugenics. And it challenges us to think deeply about the ways that eugenics continues to operate in our carceral systems, our policies, our laws, and the ongoing history of eugenic ideology. This is a book that connects past and present, tracing the history of institutionalization, incarceration, and reproductive control in the state of California, in order to show how these systems work to enforce ableism, racism, and social control, all while centering the lived experiences of those who are most impacted by these systems. Now, in the book, Jess, you emphasize that carceral eugenics isn't just a relic of the past, but a living, active logic shaping policies and institutions. And I'm so appreciative that you're here to talk about the book and to walk listeners through the concept of carceral eugenics, what it reveals about the intersections of race, disability, and class, and why it's a critical framework for abolitionist thinking. We're also going to dig into how this dynamic plays out in spaces like immigration detention centers. I really appreciated your book, Jess, not just because of its important historical and contemporary political analysis, but also for the ways that it offers a grounding point of hope for abolition. It serves as this really important reminder of how movements for disability and reproductive justice can come together to dismantle carcerality and build liberatory futures. So this is a conversation about systems, yes, but it's also about people, their lives, their resistance, and what it means to fight for a future where everyone has the opportunity to thrive. So with all of that said, to start us off, can you talk about what Menace to the Future is doing as a project? How does this book fit into the larger arc of your research and academic practice, but also your organizing? And what do you hope this book offers readers, whether they're scholars, activists, or folks who are just completely new to thinking about these systems?
Yeah, well, I'm really excited that we get to talk about carceral eugenics today because there's several things going on in the world that I think are directly related that I hope we can touch on today. And we need to talk about abolition and the practice of it more than ever. So I want to say that I am an academic, I'm an assistant professor, but I came to this research as an organizer and specifically someone who has written letters to people inside of state prisons and migrant detention centers for many years. Writing letters is a way to build solidarity and mutual aid across prison walls. And so there are two events that brought me to coin the term carceral eugenics. The first was the sterilization of people in women's prisons in California that maybe folks have heard about. I first heard about it from the human rights organization Justice Now around 2010. And later there was a hearing in the California legislature and a policy change in 2014. And this was honestly the first time I had heard about state-sponsored eugenics. It's not something that I had learned about in history classes in high school or college. I just didn't know that it was part of U.S. history, and I didn't know that it was such a huge part of California history specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So that set me on a journey to learn more about eugenics history and learn about eugenics history in California. And there's a great book by Alexandra Menace Stern, about California eugenics that I would encourage folks to read. And then the second experience that I had was in 2020, when beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of people are talking about eugenics at the time. And there was a story about a doctor who was sterilizing people in a migrant detention prison in the state of Georgia. So people were talking about the sterilizations as a form of eugenics. And I, at the time, was organizing with folks who were trying to get people out of a migrant detention prison here in San Diego. And I just kept thinking about how all the people, even if they were not sterilized, were stuck in these detention centers being exposed to COVID, or they're being deported and split up from their families and communities. And there's such a long history of using immigration restriction as a form of eugenics that's the moment when I started arguing to people that detention itself is eugenics, whether or not people are also being sterilized by medical professionals inside of detention. And so I ended up writing this book that goes back in history to explore some of the roots of how incarceration, confinement, and other forms of detention became used as a form of eugenics. And so in the early 20th century, I make the case in the book that there was this policy at the time called segregation, which argued that certain groups of people who were then at the time labeled defective, and it was a pretty broad group of people, as I talk about in the book, who there were arguments made that they should be put in these domestic colonies, segregated from the rest of society, prevented from having children, and they would be left to die there essentially. And the argument was that through this mechanism, those people would their kind, their biological strain would die out, and it would purify society of their defective blood, basically. So it's this very violent, kind of slow genocide of people who were labeled defective in the early 20th century. And so I guess I want to say, I should define eugenics. I think about eugenics as a two-part philosophy. The first part is that humans biologically inherit social and behavioral traits from their parents and their ancestors, which makes them tend towards intelligence, creativity, the ability to accumulate wealth, or towards criminality, poverty, immorality, vice, those kinds of things. So that's the first part of eugenics. And then the second part is this belief that society should then socially engineer human reproduction in order to improve society and get rid of those negative traits that are in society. And so I think about how institutions, which I'll just call disability institutions, but they include state hospitals, or what we would think about as state psychiatric hospitals, what were called state homes for the feeble-minded, and later became called training institutes and developmental centers, epileptic colonies, and I also look at state schools and adult reformatories for women as places where people who are called feeble-minded were temporarily placed. So I look at how all of these institutions became places for enacting this eugenics policy of segregation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so important to emphasize that eugenics is not limited to theories of direct reproductive intervention, right? I appreciated the way that you set that up in terms of talking about the kind of discussion that was occurring back in 2020, where, a lot of people were starting to discuss COVID in the context of eugenics, but that it was sort of limited in some ways by some outrage that would even be framed that way. Because people were like, eugenics is just reproductive control. I mean, it's like I flashed back to endless arguments with people where I would be going back to the very, coinage of the word eugenics, to Sir Francis Galton's Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development from 1883, and say, no, he says very clearly when he comes up with this term and this framework for how to improve the human stock, quote unquote, he is not just talking about specific reproductive interventions. He says, quote, eugenics is a brief word to express the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which, especially in the case of man, takes cognizance of all influences that tend in however a remote degree to give the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing steadily over the less suitable than they otherwise would have had. And it's so important to think about eugenics not just as a policy intervention around sterilization and direct intervention in reproduction, but as a entire policy framework that most importantly also encompasses everything from incarceration to welfare supports to what the social safety net even should be, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so much material in the California State Archive about the ways that the state was thinking about eugenics in the early 20th century. So they say explicitly, like, here is our plan for eugenics. And there's things like immigration restriction, anti-miscegenation laws, school segregation. So they talk a lot about preventing disabled children from attending regular schools, and segregation, institutionalization. These were all explicit strategies that the state was using to, socially engineer the biological makeup of society.
And I think you make this point so well in your book. And as we mentioned, at the core of Menace to the Future is this kind of iteration on the concept of eugenics that you've coined, carceral eugenics, which is such an important framework. Now, for listeners who haven't read the book and won't be acquainted with this term and how you use it in your work, can you define specifically what carceral eugenics is? How does it build on and then sort of diverge from more familiar understandings of eugenics, like the ones we were just talking about? And why this specificity is really important and necessary. And can you also talk about, like, how do you see it as such a crucial framework for understanding, but also ultimately leading us towards dismantling and abolishing the prison industrial complex?
Yeah. So the term carceral eugenics is actually a way of me translating into academic language what a lot of survivors of incarceration, currently incarcerated people, those of us in solidarity with incarcerated folks already know, which is that prisons and carceral spaces, like disability institutions, they control the reproduction of communities. And this is true even if prison administrators are not saying eugenicist things. So I think about it functionally. How is detention functioning? But often administrators are often saying eugenicist things, and there's a lot of that in the political record. So we also know that the prison industrial complex and disability institutions disproportionately target Black, Latinx, Indigenous, Pacific Islander, even some Asian communities, queer and trans people, disabled, mad, and neurodivergent people. And so these policies are specifically, these institutions, I guess I should say, are specifically disrupting the ways that communities create and sustain families and kinship. So, it's not just sterilization surgeries, but keeping people incarcerated or detained during their prime reproductive years. So policies like, 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimums, all of these policies are keeping people incarcerated during the time that they could have children if they chose. Prisons and disability institutions are also disabling places. They expose people to high risk of injury. They also expose people to premature aging. The food is often terrible. People don't have access to exercise or recreation, and they don't have access to quality healthcare. A lot of the healthcare inside of institutions, especially prisons, is often care of last resort. So, say you're struggling with a tooth is bothering you. Often you can't get into a dentist immediately until it's too late, and then they have to pull the tooth. And that's the only kind of dental care that you might receive. And that's absolutely connected to your well-being, right? That disrupts, what kind of food you can eat. Pain is very hard on the body. So these are disabling. And my point is, these are disabling institutions. And so that's also impacting people's ability to choose when and where and how to parent, and think about it in reproductive justice terms. But I also think about carceral spaces in terms of what I would call social reproduction and care work, and the ways that we create and recreate culture. I was just reading some really old letters that had been sent from imprisoned folks to members of my old collective. And there's so much knowledge and creativity created in those letters. And prisons and spaces of detention, they try to stop people from expressing their knowledge and their creativity. And they cut people off from their care networks, both giving and receiving care. And, I really think about this as a way of cutting people off from participating and creating the future. So it's a way of, this is part of the title of the book, Menace to the Future, is like thinking about that term came from the archive and the ways that officials were thinking about quote unquote defective people as menacing the future or threatening the future that they imagined. But I also want to try to reclaim that phrase and think about how can we menace the future that eugenicists are imagining. And
to hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.